Now, I'd really like to, I think maybe as we start off this session, can we do it from here? It's looking at what are the applications of this morning's learnings and lessons, the lessons from Ukraine, and the attributes that we can consider and should consider here. We've got three really interesting speakers. I'd like you to describe each just in a little way. I mean, I can try and describe it. I'd prefer you described your own job and why I've invited you here. Otherwise, I will probably get it slightly wrong. Yep.
Paul Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Innovative Research Universities Group. What do we do? We do three things. I think basically I have two jobs. One, we facilitate collaboration among a network of like-minded Australian universities. And we can talk a little bit about what makes us like-minded and what we're like-minded about. And the second thing is we focus a lot on higher education policy, research policy, innovation policy, and trying to make sure that the voices of our member universities and students and staff in our universities are heard in government. And just on reflection today, as someone whose day job is almost entirely caught up in that long list of things that Barney Glover listed, it was so fantastic to hear from both of you at the start, just to remember that we are part of a global community, and you've really got me thinking about how we serve and represent community, even if community isn't in the same place all the time. And that's a big focus for our university. So thank you for that.
I am Kerstin Schofer. My job is I'm the director for Global and Digital Education Innovation at UTS. And this is a completely new area for us. So this area got created out of the idea to actually expand our UTS online offerings into the world, but not just by allowing anyone to enroll, but by really customizing our offerings to different audiences in areas where demand exceeds supply. So we got approached by our now education service provider, our partner in China, because they identified a big need for online postgraduate degrees being offered customized to working professionals there in Chinese. And coming from there, we looked at a new program. We call it our Global and Digital Growth Program, to see how can we actually change our current practice and delivery systems to reach different audiences according to their needs and be super student focused and really come from a market-driven perspective and see can we respond to that. It came at a time when most Australian universities were still recovering from COVID, had a few black holes in their budgets, and then the uncertainties about international students coming on shore came into the game. And we needed to think about how do we get more resilient to this? How do we actually proactively look at opportunities that let us service a broader audience without always letting them come to us, but how can we go to them?
Thank you.
Alec, Webb, CEO of the Regional Universities Network, professional cat herder by trade. Those cats are vice chancellors. My job is essentially the same as Paul's, just for a different grouping of universities, those located in regional Australia.
Thanks. That's awesome. And so, as you can see, I wrote something today about the importance of smaller clusters of universities in Australia. It's very difficult in our 2 to 3 to 4 speed sector to have groups of haves in a relatively extreme surplus sense, and then groups of have-nots with, I think it's 14 universities in the red at the moment. And so the voice of smaller groupings of universities is really important to hear and consider in this. And then Kerstin's program is perhaps a really interesting opportunity to consider what does a university without walls or a course without walls look like? How do we, if we're taking, it's an accounting program, is it not? Or business?
It's two different master's degrees at the moment. It's
Yes.
one is Master of Technology Innovation and the other one is Business Analytics.
So if we start with that for a start, because you've taken it, it's taught by a partner in Mandarin. No?
Not quite.
You tell the story.
Okay, so yes, we partner with them because they are our in-country and market experts. They do the entire student acquisition for us, but we deliver the curriculum. So it's a real partnered approach. What we needed to do to get to this point is really understand that student audience that is hugely different from what we are used to, because we have a very small number, like we have a very small market if we compare that to working professionals in China. I think our pond, we have many, many fish in a very small pond. I think it's about 300 to 350,000 students in so-called external study modes. That is a mix of online and hybrid in the postgraduate space. And in China, every year we have about 3 million people that want to do a postgraduate degree and they don't get in. They don't pass the exam, they don't meet the threshold, and they have it even harder if they've been working for many years because they're not used to this type of study anymore to pass the entry exam. So, and they are completely excluded from further study. But they are facing certain barriers. They probably don't even want to come here, or even if they wanted to, they might not meet the criteria. They're facing mobility barriers, language barriers, maybe financial barriers, we don't know. And we just wanted to bridge these barriers and provide them an opportunity. From our end, we really needed to look at how can we deliver that, because we are not used to delivering courses in Chinese and Mandarin. And we first thought we would do this with one course as a pilot in a faculty that has lots of bilingual or Chinese-speaking academics. Then we thought we don't want to do that because that is piloting something that we can't scale. So we look at that more, we needed to look at it more from a systems perspective. So what would be a scalable model that we could apply across a range of disciplines in the future? Because we haven't set this up to just deliver these 2 degrees. We really want to grow this across various disciplines, depending on where actually the educational needs are. And for that, we had to change the way we deliver curriculum and streamline a few things, create a new way of, so we built a completely new central bilingual team that can be the bridge between our Chinese speaking online learning instructors that we have directly working with the students and the academics and our faculties that are the subject matter experts.
So just one more question before we move on. Is the goal to make them UTS students or students how do they?
They are UTS students. They from day one. So they are fully, UTS delivers the entire degree. So nothing is delivered by the partner in China. They just help us with student support, with very broad student support. And they also help us finding the students. So they are UTS students. They receive an Australian degree. They don't receive a Chinese degree. So the degree is also only recognized in Australia. And these are students that want that. They don't necessarily want to study in their home system because they want to work in multinationals. They want to, many of them actually run their own businesses and want to improve them, scale them, or kind of like learn new skills to take their companies to a different level. And some of them maybe also have ideas and want to start new companies. So it's a very different audience, and they don't really find themselves well supported within their home system.
So Paul, moving on to you, what does this mean for, that's a great example of T&E going on. What does this mean for TNE in Australia and the Ukrainian experience?
Well, I think I would start by thinking about access and who has access to higher education. You know, like Igor, I was a student of history. I think about like, why do we have a group of universities that works together under the banner of the IRU or any other group? Our universities were founded in the late 60s, early 70s, and then again in the reforms of the 80s, as communities grew to expand access to higher education. So governments of all political persuasions back in the day decided that what we needed to do was build new universities. It wasn't just a question of expanding more campuses of the existing universities. It was about creating new institutions, try and do things differently, but fundamentally it was about access. And I think fast forward to 2025, we're a group of universities, multi-campus universities around Australia, but also increasingly international campuses, offshore campuses. But there's still that ethos of broadening access, making sure we have an equitable higher education system, and thinking about what does that look like in 2025. And I think the online example is another interesting development. How do we make sure that students have the flexibility? If students want to come on campus, they can have a good campus experience. If they want to study online, they can have a good online experience. If they want a mix of both. And I think one of the things we're trying to do constantly is think about policy and regulatory and funding settings that will enable that, enable the provision of quality education to more students in a more accessible and affordable way. And I guess universities are on the front lines of trying to figure out, what's on campus, where do you invest? Are you investing in buildings? Are you investing in new online platforms? It's complicated, but it's part of that mission of kind of making sure that higher education is accessible. Did I answer your question at all?
No.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no, but I think you certainly went to the some of the key aspects of that question. One of the other things that it'd be great to get you to reflect on, and then Alec, is the connection. How do we connect with students when we're building new delivery models? How do we get to that point where, in Ukraine, they've seen where online was not sufficient. They had to have them. How do we go beyond what we've got?
And actually, just to come back to your question about transnational education, I think within our universities, there's a super interesting conversation going on about how do you build those connections? How do you support mobility in both directions? If you find yourself in 2025 the custodian of a university with multiple campuses in Australia and multiple international campuses, what are you doing to connect students across those campuses? What are you doing to give students opportunities and staff to move across and have different experiences, tap into a global network? I mean, La Trobe, for example, in the thinking about their new campus in India, a lot of it is about research and scholarly links between staff in India and in Australia, as well as opportunities for teaching and student mobility. So I think that is an active conversation within our universities at the moment about what does that look like. And there will be new models, I think, which is exciting. I think the other thing I would say about our universities is there's a lot of work going on at the moment, and you heard it again from Professor Glover earlier about the tertiary system and how our tertiary system can be more joined up. I think, we've been talking about universities without walls, and we still talk about, we sort of define different kinds of universities in Australia by saying things like they're sandstone. Our universities, we got called the Gumtree universities, which is, I guess it's not a wall, but it's still a sort of weird physical descriptor of a certain ethos of an institution. But, at least half of our students are not coming straight from year 12 with an ATAR. And I know in like other parts of the system, the vast majority of students are coming straight out of year 12 with an ATAR. I think almost 20% of our students are coming through a TAFE pathway into university. So what does that look like? And how can we have a more differentiated system where universities can kind of not all try and do the same thing, but actually focus on, okay, we have a different student cohort. And what does it look like to support them and serve them? And, what La Trobe is doing is different from what the University of Melbourne is doing, but that's a good thing.
I think the access question is critically important. And I also think it's a question of choice and flexibility, but also opportunity, because I think between campus mobility, between country mobility is super important, but it's also probably a luxury for a large percentage of many populations. And I looked at some Holland IQ research when they did their Global Education Outlook report in 2024. And by, I think, within the next 10 years, they expect an additional 1 billion learners to be in the tertiary system, and 75% coming from Africa and Asia. And from demographics that won't be able to afford that. So what do we do to offer them alternatives and actually access to programs if they can't afford that? That's what we're really thinking about by still maintaining brand identity. And it's probably something that we keep thinking about, and we haven't quite figured that out yet, but and we haven't resolved that with the current offering, but I think that's a very important conversation.
Absolutely. Alec, do you want to go to locality, belonging, engagement?
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. I think on T&E, there's a really interesting question at the heart of the Australian tertiary education system, though. And it's your point that you opened with. There are some universities in the black, there are a lot that aren't. Well, how do you go up and create those T&E opportunities if you have no capital to do so? And that's going to, I think, exacerbate. It's not going to close. And so there are some fundamental questions there about what does Brand Australia, when it comes to T&E, actually look like? In regards to community, it's a really interesting thing because everyone had always said, well, we won't need any need for a university campus. Everyone will just study online. And you hadn't really see that happen. Now, I represent 6 universities. About 50% of our student load is studying online. That's a bit of an oddity in the sector. And then this pesky thing called COVID came along, and it turns out all you need to force everybody to work and study remotely is a pandemic. It's not exactly, what I'd call a great outcome. But then it's really interesting when you start to look at the data, what has happened since then. And it's actually a rapid increase in multimodal, not on external. So there is still the majority of students wanting the flexibility of online study, but wanting that connection to either the faculty or to fellow students. And it's been, Australia's a very big place. 40 universities is not too many. And so student satisfaction differed wildly between cohorts. Those that had higher student satisfaction were those that studied in a traditional on-campus mode, not external. And so the question becomes, now as we've created the tools and everybody's operating in this space, what is that having an impact? Well, it's saying quite clearly students value that connection, even in regional universities where you find the student cohorts, similar to Paul's universities, tend not to be directly school leavers. They value that connection. Beyond that, though, there's a question about, well, what happens if you're a mature age student that's studying at university for the first time, your first in family, you've got a couple of kids, maybe a job. What does study look like? Historically, it was, you just do it online. Well, universities are saying, actually, we think there's a better way, and that's changing the curriculum. So that is going from a 13-week model to intensive 6 weeks blocks. And guess what happened? Student retention went up. The numbers of students who left dropped, plummeted. It's 18 percentage points last time I looked for one of my members. And that was a direct result of engaging with the student community who said, it's not that we can't study, it's the fact that 13 weeks is a really long time and life happens in that time period. So how about we shorten that, do a more intensive student block? Because in 6 weeks, I can kind of push to aside some of the things that pop up in life and tackle them afterwards.
Any questions from the floor? I will because I have some other zones. I'm really interested in this idea of the unserved. So we have 1 million students in theory who are just waiting to come into higher education over the next 24 years and come into the higher education or tertiary education sector. It's what the Accord proposes. As Kerstin said, there's maybe 1 billion additional potential learners overseas just waiting, those getting to those people and including them isn't just a matter of opening up our course doors. It's a matter of price. It's a matter of support. It's a matter of delivery mode. How are we going to do it? Do we need different models to be able to cope with that? And, particularly the price point.
I think Paul has something to say about the price point and job-ready graduates. I think in a short answer, yes, that there does need to be there. The challenge, of course, is how can one institution be everything to everybody? And that then requires us to think about what does the higher education landscape look like? Whilst Paul and I here is great, where are the new HEPs, right? Where are the non-university higher education providers that can provide that? There is a key question here as well about what's happening in the schooling system at the moment. Year 12 completion rates, they do not make for pretty reading in this country, but the increase of what we call NEET, not in education, employment or training, that cohort is growing. So when we think about the Accord targets, I would say that for most coming out of the school system at present, they're pretty well served. There are clear pathways into university, even if you don't choose an ATAR pathway, whether that is through the vocational sector and whether that is through sub-bachelor programs into the traditional university. But it's what happens to everyone else, because academic preparedness is still a highly, highly correlated metric of success at university. And so there are some really thorny issues that we need to tackle, not just in the education portfolio, but also from a social perspective.
Great.
Thank you. So I think, we kind of heard Barney earlier sort of outlining the priorities of the Accord agenda, and we're going to have a new tertiary education commission. I think the feeling in our universities is that we're positive about the direction of those policy reforms. The Accord is fundamentally about lifting participation and doing that by focusing on bringing in more students who are currently underrepresented in our system. And we're positive about that. And we can have a big debate about whether we need a new tertiary education commission and whether the funding model should be managed growth. I think the view in our universities is that if we just let the free market rip, that delivers lots of good things, but it also has lots of problems. And I think we've seen participation grow over the last 20 years, but we've seen progress on equity measures stalled. And we've seen collaboration between universities and TAFE stalled. So we don't think that just letting the free market rip gets you all of the kind of public goods that we would want from our university system. So then we have to look at, well, how do we actually support those students who are currently underrepresented or underserved? Part of it is geography, I think. Part of it is the international picture as well. But, we have some pressing issues in our system. And I'll talk about job-ready graduates as long as you want me to. But the data clearly shows that what job-ready graduates, which is the way that we choose which students pay which fees for which courses, job-ready graduates is pushing students from poorer backgrounds out of the higher cost courses. It's clear. The data is clear. So, in law, for example, low SES, low socioeconomic background student commencements in law are dropping off a cliff. But all the other student commencements in law are growing. And you see similar patterns in other high-cost courses. So if we really want to support underrepresented students to come into higher education and succeed in our system, we've got to do something about that, because we're not going to meet targets for low SES student participation unless we do something about JRG.
I think what Alec touched on is really providing options and to allow a lot of flexibility for students, that they can choose to come to campus for that experience, but they don't have to actually complete their subject or their course. And I think that's where we should get to, because, for example, where we are in the middle of Sydney, only quite privileged people can live in the exact vicinity. So others, it might take them a long time to commute to class back and forth. And they might be very choosy about which class they want to attend on campus and not all the classes. So I think we need to get to that flexibility that students can fit study within their other life responsibilities. And it doesn't matter if they're school leavers or if they're working professionals, because we know that most of them work and not just a couple of hours. And I think that's the mindset, that we are student-centric and that we look at what do they need to feel well supported and are actually best equipped to finish their degrees.
Great. Stephen, we've got questions over here. There's.
I'd just like to take issue with Alec's point. I mean, the problem with emergency online teaching, which happened during COVID, putting your old lecture online is not best practice online teaching. And I think that all the evidence nationally and internationally is that outcomes are just as good for online teaching and face-to-face. I'd also like to compliment Kerstin. The problem with international students in Australia obviously is well known to everyone. The sector depends on it, but it's an unethical program because we're teaching the kids of rich Malaysian parents, and we're not teaching people who need the wonderful education that can be provided. So we're not going to get a social license in that environment. And I think that's what, one of the things that the sector needs to tackle.
Thanks, Rich. And
hi again, Dino, still. I just wanted to pick up. So we're talking here about, the experience that we've learned from Ukraine. And again, going back to one of the points that Jarnia made at the end was about flexibility. It seems to me that one of the points that you made, I don't wish to pick on you, but you kept saying in our system, in our system. This is how people can succeed in our system. And our system is based on a hierarchy, an inherent hierarchy about what we valorize in education. If we want to actually decolonize our educational system, we need to rethink, and I think, Jason, you said epistemacy. Sounds about right. If we actually want to change what we do here, we're going to have to hold up a mirror to ourselves and challenge ourselves about our assumptions about what education looks like and what it should look like and what our system is and who gets to win in our system and who gets in. Because also throughout all of this, we're assuming that people want to get a degree and maybe they don't. And maybe it's us that needs to change. And we need to think again, going back to the points this morning about the relationality of learning and the co-creation of education and knowledge and knowledges. So I think the thing for me in all of this is if we want to do it here, if we want to learn from Ukraine, we actually need to hold up a mirror to who are we as educators and what are we assuming and how can we decolonize our thinking in a way that changes how we approach education from the ground up.
Great point. Who wants to respond to that?
I agree. And I think to respond to your critique, I think part of the reason perhaps that I talk the way I do about the system is because I'm not in a classroom teaching students. I'm in Canberra working on policy. And there is that view of the sort of the way the system is operating and the sort of system level metrics and regulation and all of that. But I think that's right. And I think what we would be pushing for, and to Stephen's point earlier, it's going to be very interesting to see whether if we have a new tertiary education commission, we have a more managed system. And, government, I think, is more actively intervening and managing because of perceived problems in the current system. Whether that does, the promise is removing some of the kind of cutthroat competition and leaving room for people to experiment and try different things and try and differentiate and not have to do everything the same as everybody else. And dare I say it, not care so much about rankings and focus more on community and students. How will it actually play out? Like, we'll see. I think we are, someone said earlier, cautiously optimistic. I think I think we should be trying. And I think it's you know, the promise of working with a commission and thinking about new compact agreements and new funding models and needs-based funding. You know, there's a promise there that we should be grabbing it and trying to help make sure it really works. But yeah, I totally take your point.
I would agree with most of what Paul has said there. I think the question about what is an education and how is that valued? At the moment, that's predominantly by either institutions themselves. You're never going to become a vice chancellor, for instance, if you haven't gone through the rigors of academic study in at least some degree. I can see you smirking there, Paul. Not picking on your VCs, don't worry. But one of the key components there is also what's recognized by industry, right? Industry, for all their moaning about how much they hate the value of a degree, graduates come to us, they don't know anything. They've been making that argument for well on 100 years. You can go back and check newspaper articles from the 30s where they said, well, I wouldn't take anyone from a university. I'd take someone who's, you know, come to us beaten down by life. They've got experience. That exists and will continue to exist. So the question of the system, you know, it's a language, I guess, that Paul and I fall into, you know, when we walk the halls of Parliament and departments here, is where we talk about the system as it currently exists and where we would like to see it go. I think if I talked and said that system's no good and it needs to be pulled down, I'd be talking myself out of a job really quickly. So in self-interest, I will continue to talk about that. And just to pick up the point around various models and international, I think the key thing is that universities need the funding security to be able to do that and to be able to explore innovation in this sector. And at the moment, we're perhaps seeing 5 or 6 universities in the country that probably are not in a fiscal position to explore, and yet those are the same 5 or 6 universities that, you know, serve a propensity of Indigenous students, students from low SES backgrounds, first in family, students with a disability. And so there are key questions when the ATEC comes online that I think those universities will be having with the government that says, well, we're doing what it is you want us to do, and look at our balance sheet. So what does that look like in a funding sense? And so while Paul is optimistic, I try to join him in the optimistic class as often as I can, but it's a pretty stark reality out there at the moment, I think, for probably, you know, 10, 12 universities in this country. It's not pretty reading come budget time. And there are going to be some really hard decisions that have to be made at the same time when we do the work the government wants us to do.
I've got a final question for the three of you, starting with you, Kerstin. Now, you don't need to talk about the UTS situation, but maybe just your experience more broadly. We're famously a sector that is not particularly agile. We don't respond to threats, changes, opportunities quickly. People usually liken it to turning around battleships or cruise liners, but much less fast. Obviously, in the Ukrainian situation, they've had to completely change by force of circumstance. You, in taking creating that opportunity in China, you've seen an opportunity. It obviously, we've talked about it. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why you're here today, because it's an interesting thing and rare. How do we become more agile? That's what I want to know. Answer from each of you.
Late last year, I had a very interesting conversation with a global thought leader in higher education, and Kerstin. She comes from media, but she was the president of a college in New York City that also has a very high percentage of lower SES students. And she is now a top advisor to Michael Crow at ASU, who is hugely successful in actually turning ASU into like a global domination, I might say. And she said, you need support, you need your cheerleaders right from the top, and you need freedom to experiment and actually to put things into action. And that has been my experience. I've had the support right from the top, And they trusted me in making some bold suggestions and letting me go with it. Obviously, I kind of argued them well enough to get their support, but I think you need trust in your people and allow them to do things and not. I see in many universities that I've seen and I've worked with and at a few in this country, people are not bold enough to make decisions and are always asking a million opinions, and everybody needs to agree to everything. And this is not how the Americans work. And sometimes, I mean, right now, America is not a great reference point, but in the ASU case, I have to say, and what I've seen from Kerstin, they have the courage to make bold decisions and just go with it. And this is also what you do when you're in a crisis or in a state of emergency. You just have to make a decision and go with it.
But can I have it, Justin, before you hand over the microphone, do we not also need a safety net for when things go wrong?
You need to make your risk assessment. Yes. Yes, you kind of have to look at what could go wrong and what would I do to avoid it, or if something goes wrong, how do I? So yeah, what's my safety net? Yeah, you do.
Personal and institutional, I think.
Yes, but that was institutionally meant, but yes, obviously. But I think in the current situation, and also not in our culture here, nobody would make a bold decision without having assessed the risk. Absolutely.
Great.
Oh, I know Kerry Lee is no longer in the room, but I think regulation is something that needs to be seriously addressed when it comes to agility. Now, people might accuse universities of being a little bit like the Titanic and they're very slow to turn and move, but there is a very valid reason why all of those councils exist and those regulations exist. And that is to assure ourselves that we, have got that safety net approach. We're not charging head on into an iceberg, although ironically, that would have probably helped the Titanic as opposed to the grazing that it did. I think the other thing that sits alongside that is funding. And so in Australia, we used to have this great thing called the Office of Learning and Teaching. We need to bring that back because it was a government-backed mechanism that allowed universities to innovate and to explore what the potential was. And we need that. We need it back. We need TEXA and the regulatory frameworks to be loosened to allow us to respond quicker through our own internal practices. I know university governance isn't exactly the topic of the year, but it is something that seriously needs to be looked at because universities are getting suffocated in regulation.
I'm going to answer in a slightly different way, which is to say that I think there is a lot of agility in our system. Last year, we ran a series of projects across our network of universities just to bring people together and let them talk about what they were doing on AI, students, staff from different parts of the university. And I was actually I think I started 2025 panicking about AI. And I finished 2025 actually feeling really good about how people in universities, staff, students, teaching staff, professional staff were kind of grappling with the issues. There is a lot of innovation happening. There's a lot of adaptation happening, drawing on Jason and, people in the system who've thought deeply about these things. But the other thing that I thought was really great, yes, of course, universities need to show that they're responsive to the changing expectations of the community and industry and policymakers and regulators. But universities also have to sort of hold room for people to have different opinions and to ask deeper questions and to say, of course, we have to think about assessment right now, but could we also not have a discussion about what are we doing here? And who is owning all these, what's the ownership of these companies? And are we privatizing public education? And what about the sustainability impacts of data centers? And, universities are where people are asking these questions while at the same time adapting and innovating and being agile. And that's a special thing. And we should be positive about that. And I think we get caught in this discussion about social license and everything's terrible and like everyone hates universities and it's all bad. But actually, I think part of the reason that we have these debates are because universities are so embedded in the community. And we have issues in our society with inequality and conflict and politics and housing affordability. And people care about these issues and they argue about them, as they should. Before I took this job, I worked in the US for 4 years with American universities, and my son, who just graduated uni 2 months ago, he used to say when we lived in America, Dad, like, why everyone in America like argues about everything all the time? Like, couldn't they just like chill out and like go to the beach for a day or something? And then we came home to Australia and he said, Dad, like, no one in Australia argues about anything. Wouldn't it be good if we like argued a bit more about stuff? And I think it's okay to like argue about important things in society, and universities play an important role in that. And that is going to mean sometimes that people are cranky with universities, but we should be confident and positive about the role that we play in society.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a wonderful spot to stop. So thank you so much, Paul, Kerstin, and Alec. A real treat to have you here. So thank you.
There's been a slon in the room all day today. Google tells me slon is Ukrainian for elephant. And there's been one sitting very large and very quietly in the background. And that elephant is the times are changing. The paradigm is shifting. The world is not the world I grew up in, or even all you people are much younger than me. We are probably, at best, we're back in the 18th century, where there are dynastic conflicts roughly given by rules of war. More likely, we're in 17th century Europe, where Europe disemboweled itself over 30 years in the originally named 30 Years' War. It's not going to happen here like it's happened in the Ukraine. We are too far away for that to happen. But the People's Liberation Army's Navy can navigate our shores, and we can't do a damn thing about it. And no matter whatever we spend on submarines or whatever, we will not be able to do it as we are now configured, which is where you all come in. Because our salvation as a nation, and I retract salvation, it's not that dire, but our prosperity, our continuation, our life, the way we live as a nation of migrants now, depends on our ability to grow and change. In a military sense, just to make it too damn hard to do it, to bother us, and they'll just leave us alone. In an economic sense, because the world is not going to keep going richer the way it has. The world has to deal with people my age in very large numbers. The way to deal with those are universities. It is in higher education. This is not an instrumentalist attitude that we marketize everything and that we look for a rate of return on every degree, on every transaction. Certainly not. That way it leads to failure. But the paradigm that as it shifts will need what you people do. The Ukraine soldiers on gallantly. It's an extraordinary achievement. To this year's a war with a nation yay bigger, with armed forces that turned out to be not very good, but nevertheless there are an awful lot of them. The Ukraine has adapted, has adjusted in an extraordinary way. There'll be PhDs starting to be written now, whatever happens, on how they did it. I don't know. Australian Major General called Mick Ryan probably does. He's worth reading. He spends a lot of time in the Ukraine. But what I suspect happened is because Ukraine, in its own way, had a learning culture. They did not learn how to use drones to destroy armoured warfare overnight. They didn't get a manual from the Americans, or from anybody, in fact, that showed them how to do it. They worked it out. It is a learning culture. When I was a boy, I always wanted to go to a place called Kursk in the Ukraine, which was the biggest armoured battle of the world ever seen in 1943. They refought it a couple of months ago, and last year, in fact, and the Ukrainians stopped them because their technology was better. As far as I understand, Ukraine was effectively demilitarized. Didn't have much of a standing army at all when the Russians rolled over. It's why they thought they were going to get to the airport in Kyiv and take over in 72 hours. They got the shock of their lives when largely volunteers, self-forming into independent battalions, just dug in and stopped them. That's the other thing. On the one hand, you have technology, and that comes from learning societies. And the other hand, you've got social cohesion. And social cohesion in a nation like Ukraine, far more than here, is based on ethnicity. You're Ukrainians. You've been there for an awfully long while. With the exception of Indigenous Australians, we are a nation of migrants. We've been here for a bare 200 years. What holds us together and what held the Ukrainians together, I suspect, are the same things. A commitment to ideals, not in part nationality, but more important, ideals, that elections matter, that freedom of speech and opportunity, stress opportunity every damn time, matter. And those values come from education. I am an enormous believer in the training system. I think it is vastly underfunded and vastly underrepresented in this country. I know that because I'm getting 2 bathrooms restored in Sydney, and it's costing a bomb because we can't find any tradesmen. But trades are not going to teach you values. And in a fragmented culture as we now are in electronically, it is standing up for the education system to teach those values, that you don't get on TikTok. Now, that's a whole different set of arguments about actually what those values should be and how we teach them. But I think in Australia, in our guts, we know what they are. And I think it does come down to the whole idea of fair go. When the RN arrived, the Royal Navy arrived in 1788 at Botany Bay, and whether they should have been there is another question altogether, but they were. And when Philip, the commander, looked around and realised, we are in a lot of trouble, boys. There's not enough food, there's no grain. So he immediately said, right, half rations. In the British Navy, when half rations were announced, that was everybody, from the commander right down to the bottom. You are all in this together. And I think that's probably where it's the cultural origins of the fair go come from. And if there's a core Australian value, it is the right of everybody to equality of opportunity, equality of care and support, but a fair go in life. And that is a sense of value that only a good education system can teach. You can disagree with most of that. That's a very old man's attitude towards the way the world works, but it got us here so far. The paradigm is shifting. What happens in the Ukraine will not happen off our shores, but our world will change. The system must adapt, and it is already adapting in ways it doesn't quite realise. Changes have started to happen. The demand-driven system. It was abolished by the Libs, probably against Simon Birmingham, the minister's wishes, but it was abolished by the Libs, and yet it's back now in one form or another for low-income, for low ACS Australians. It will evolve and change over time. We will grow our commitment to education because in a relatively functioning democracy, people will realise we don't have much choice. It's all we've got to grow and prosper. What it means for all of you, bugger if I know, but you will be here, your institutions will be here one way or another for as long as we are here. They will change. They probably need to change quite dramatically and quite fast, but they will change. What will happen is the ideals will continue. Yana Sichikova said it today, and I stand with her on it, and yet the universities did not vanish. Thank you.
If I may, I will tell several words of reaction on great speech of Steve and reaction of today's conversation. Really, Steve has great conceptual ideas in his final speech. Completely agree. 2 days ago, by the way, probably you know that Steve journalist, but he is also historian, and it's Now you know. I look at Steve, and as former historian, he told me during our trip by bay in Sydney that in the middle of 19th century, people in Sydney were afraid that Russian ships will come to Sydney because it was Eastern, also called Crimean War of Russian Empire against British Empire, Ottoman Empire, France, and Sardinia, later Italy. And that's why fort, you know, this fort in Bay of Sydney was rebuilt, etc. Surely Russian ship didn't come in the middle of 19th century. Even more, Russian was beaten by coalition and lost Crimea. You know, in 2014, they occupied Crimea, but then on their own territory, they were defeated and Russian ships were burned not near Australian coast, but were burned in Sevastopol, next to Sevastopol, and next to Berdyansk, in Berdyansk Bay, by own equipage. And it's also our history. Now Russians try to be very powerful in propaganda, the second army of the world, etc. But everybody can see that little Ukraine already for years defend own land. And it's also a lesson from modern history. Surely we can compare Australia and Ukraine. Surely you are in much better position. You separated from everybody, not only from enemies, but from everybody. But you are, as well as we are, living in a globalized world. Many times we have told about COVID without borders. You here and we in Ukraine, as well as educators all over the world, changed our way of education because of COVID. And COVID prepared us greatly for relocation. Other countries, after the end of COVID, okay, it's in the past, let's do in the same way as we worked before. But the world not the same and educational system already not the same. And who continues this line, he will win. And it's also lesson from this. So during today's discussion, I found dozens of issues which can be compared and continued in sphere, not only, of course, university without walls, but I mean as a continuation of today's insights, today's ideas about wide variety of spheres. And I really appreciate this, and I would like to thank again to each of you for coming and for such interesting participation, inclusion in these discussions. Thank you again. And for team and especially, you understand that.
Right. Thank you, everybody. We're done. Thanks very much for coming.
It's great. Just for me, it was also not formal because in
Yes,
sometimes that's very foreign.
Yes.
Great atmosphere.
Yeah.
It's great.
Both were did a wonderful job. Thank you. Oh, that's fine. I'll do the.
Sure?
Yep. All good.